Johannes Kepler is a figure known to everyone and no one. His name is embedded in the fabric of astronomy, to the point that anyone who has studied the subject to the least degree has heard it. His 3 laws of planetary motion paved the way for Isaac Newton and the acceptance of heliocentrism. But of the man himself, of his life, his passions, his tragedies, almost nothing is remembered, and what is has been obscured by legend. Many people, including myself on this channel, have described him as a mystic, but this word only partly grasps the wild, reeling, incandescent force that was his mind. Kepler was a dreamer, a revelator, a true believer, but one tempered by a new discipline of thought we now call the scientific method. He was thus the embodiment of humankind's slow, clumsy transition from a world of magic to one of science. Technically, he was the exact opposite of a mystic, for mystic means initiate, one led by others into realms of secret knowledge. Kepler's discoveries, conversely, were entirely his own, and he was determined from the start to share them with the world. Kepler was born on the 27th of December, 1571, in the town of Weil, now Weil der Stadt, in what was then the Holy Roman Empire. We know quite a lot about his early life, partly because he documented his actions in obsessively confessional fashion, and partly because, as a court astrologer, he composed astrological biographies of many of his family members. His family were impoverished former nobility, once knights in the service of the emperor, now fallen to the craftsman class, a position his father, Heinrich, was completely unable to hold. After failing at several businesses, he tried his hand at his ancestral profession and served as a mercenary in foreign wars. This meant that not only was money scarce and infrequent, a problem, incidentally, that would plague the younger Kepler for much of his life, but that his father was almost never home. When he was, he tended to take out his frustrations on his family, particularly his wife Katerina, in violent altercations. He destroyed everything, said Kepler in his biography. He was a wrongdoer, abrupt and quarrelsome. Katerina, according to Kepler, was small, thin, swarthy, gossiping and quarrelsome, of a bad disposition. He was not alone in holding this view of her. Many in his community found her difficult to like, and that, combined with her hobbies of herbalism and potion-making, would prove disastrous for her in future. Even before birth, Kepler's life would be determined by the political and religious realities of his time, realities that conspired to tear his world apart. Kepler's birthplace, the Holy Roman Empire, had also been, 5.5 decades before, the birthplace of the Protestant Reformation, a shattering of centuries of religious certainty that would yet take 30 years of war and 12 million lives to heal. In 1555, the empire had attempted to forge a compromise, the Peace of Augsburg, that had defined the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, or whose realm, their religion. In other words, the semi-independent dukedoms of the Holy Roman Empire, which was more of a confederation akin to the European Union rather than a unitary state, would be allowed to decide whether their people followed the Catholic or Lutheran doctrine. Like most good ideas on paper, the compromise broke in the face of reality. For instance, it said nothing about the faiths of the people already living in those regions. Kepler's home duchy, Württemberg, was a Protestant state, and Kepler was of a Protestant family. But the city of his birth, Weil, was majority Catholic. Also, the peace made no allowances for when the lottery of hereditary monarchy inevitably placed a ruler of contrary faith on the throne, an omission that would in time cost Kepler dearly. According to Kepler, his gestation lasted 224 days, 9 hours, and 53 minutes. Precisely how he arrived at this number is not known, though presumably he must have asked his mother some fairly penetrating questions. If you do the math, you will notice that he was 2 months premature, a fate that left him sickly and weak for the rest of his life. If that wasn't enough, a childhood bout of smallpox left him severely nearsighted. Not the best start in life for an astronomer. Nonetheless, his family, or at least his mother, recognized his budding talents and relocated to the Protestant town of Leonberg to enable his education. There he was fast-tracked to the Latin school, the school for scholars and, more importantly, prospective preachers. School life for Kepler was difficult. He had few resources to draw on, and he was frequently pulled out of class to do farm work, something he was obviously ill-suited for. The academic atmosphere was intensely competitive. Kepler's supreme ability led to jealousy and anger from other students. Tellingly, Kepler made a list of enemies at school, but not a list of friends. Outside of class, Kepler engaged in the sort of recreation common to a bright child of his time, memorizing long psalms, making anagrams, puzzles, and riddles. In 1588, when Kepler was 17, his father disappeared, presumed to have died in a foreign war. A year later, Kepler was accepted to the University of Tübingen, a center for Protestant theology influenced by Martin Luther disciple Philipp Melanchthon. By then, Kepler was settled on becoming a Lutheran pastor, and to that end began a degree in theology and philosophy. But chance would lead him down a different path. At Tübingen, Kepler befriended the mathematics professor, Michael Mastlin, who likely introduced him to Copernicanism. Astronomy at the time was considered a branch of mathematics, since finding physical causes in the motions of the heavens was considered pointless. This was the beginning of a lifelong correspondence between Kepler and Mastlin, who in the early days would often have to remind the young Kepler that the mathematical proofs he had idly discovered were in fact ancient. Although it was obvious that Kepler possessed prodigious mathematical ability, he was less than enthused when Mastlin recommended him for a mathematical teaching position in Graz, 200 miles away. It wasn't so much the distance that bothered him as the position itself. While he considered he might have a talent for mathematics, his first desire was to serve his God. He only agreed to the position after being assured that he would be allowed to return to Tübingen if, for whatever reason, Graz didn't pan out. Kepler's hesitancy to take the first great decision of his life reveals something fundamental about his character. He was a man of God first, and a man of science second. Every truth he uncovered, every calculation he undertook, every stance he fought for, from then until his death, all were for the greater glory of God. By all accounts, Kepler was not a good teacher. His mind was constantly leaping from one topic to the next, while 1,000 ideas would flood it virtually simultaneously. He would thus often relate his lectures completely out of sequence as new ideas occurred to him, leaving his students lost at sea. It is therefore perhaps fortunate that he had few students, as mathematics was not a popular subject among the young nobles who studied at Graz. To fill time, Kepler was asked to teach several other subjects, including rhetoric and ethics that he had never touched at university, apparently getting by on pure intellect. As district mathematician, Kepler's job was to publish, quote, calendars, astrological forecasts for the coming month, to be read by the local aristocracy. Kepler's opinions on astrology were decidedly mixed. Indeed, he would later publish a treatise on the subject called The Third-Party Intervention, because he sought to find a middle way between outright rejection of astrology and superstitious acceptance of, as he put it, necromantic monkey shines. While he believed that the zodiac was an entirely fictitious creation and should be ignored, the positions of the planets were of divinatory value, for reasons I will explain later. He was also not above mixing idealism with raw pragmatism. In a letter to Mastlin, he wrote, "With all prognostications, I see to it that I give my circle of readers a happy enjoyment of the vastness of nature, with sentences which happen to occur to me and appear true, in the hope that readers might be tempted thereby to raise my salary." His predictions were admirably practical. When asked to advise on a war, he wrote, "Heaven cannot do much harm to the stronger of two enemies, nor help the weaker much. He who strengthens himself with good advice, soldiers, weapons, and courage, also brings heaven to his side. However ambivalently he may have pursued his job, it was while at Graz that Kepler realized that mathematics could be his divine calling. He may never be a preacher of God's word, but he would use mathematics to uncover the beauty of God's plan. He would pray in numbers. Copernicus's heliocentrism had taken deep hold of Kepler's soul. He saw it as the true construction of God's universe. Quote, "Just like a human architect, God has approached the foundation of the world according to order and rule," wrote Kepler, "and so measured out everything that one might suppose architecture did not take nature as a model, but rather that God had looked upon the manner of building of the soon-to-be-fashioned human." It was in the Timaeus, Plato's attempt to divine the origin of the universe, that Kepler saw the first gleanings of his vision. The Timaeus describes the universe as the conscious construct of an intelligent mind. This mind was good, and thus it would be unthinkable that, quote, "He who is the best should make anything except the most beautiful. As order is more beautiful than disorder, and eternity more beautiful than finity, the universe was both eternal and ordered, or in Greek, cosmos. As the universe was composed in the image of its craftsman, it too was endowed with soul and intelligence, which resided at its center. To Kepler, this center had to be the sun, which represented the body of God. The outer sphere of fixed stars, the image of the waters of creation, represented the body of Christ, while the void between, filled with the rays of the sun's light, represented the Holy Spirit. But, Kepler wondered, if heliocentrism was the true expression of God's design, why did he only create 6 planets? It was while teaching his unenthusiastic students that he believed he'd found an answer. He was plotting out the various times for so-called grand conjunctions, times when Jupiter passes in front of Saturn, which occur roughly 20 years apart in 3 different points on the ecliptic. These 3 points form a nearly perfect equilateral triangle that rotates around the ecliptic with each 60-year period, called a trigon. One of the advantages of the Copernican system over the geocentric is that, with the application of some simple geometry, it allowed you to calculate the relative distances between any 2 planets. What flabbergasted Kepler upon construction of this pattern was that the rotating triangle also created a second circle whose diameter was of the same ratio to the outer circle as the orbit of Jupiter was to the orbit of Saturn. Could the triangle, or other regular polygons, be the base upon which the universe was constructed? Try as he might, however, Kepler could not get the polygons to fit the orbits. And then he had a brainwave. The universe was not flat. It was 3-dimensional. Obviously, God would not use flat figures to plot his creation. He would use solid figures. The Greek geometer Euclid had shown thousands of years earlier that there could only be 5 regular polyhedrons. 5 polyhedrons, 6 planets. Could it really be that simple? The Timaeus had tied the 5 regular polyhedra to the 5 elements: earth, water, air, fire, and ether. But what if instead each polyhedron encompassed the volume of the planet's orbits, its vertices touching the surface of its sphere? Kepler had no truck with the concurrent idea that the planets orbited on solid crystalline spheres, calling it absurd and monstrous. But he believed the spheres had to exist in some form, physical or ethereal. Before he could advance his theory any further, Kepler first had to, quote, "see whether the idea would fit Copernican orbits, or if my happiness will be blown away with the wind." To his delight, it did, or at least enough to dazzle a young, excitable mind. His conclusions may seem fanciful to us, but Kepler's willingness to discard his beliefs in the face of evidence was a major advance for his time. Kepler's vision for God's blueprint for creation is as follows. Between Jupiter and Saturn, a cube, the noblest of all polyhedra, as it represented the 3 dimensions of space. Between Mars and Jupiter, the largest distance, a tetrahedron, which, according to Kepler, almost dares to compete with the cube for primacy. Between Mars and Earth, the dodecahedron. Between Earth and Venus, the icosahedron. And between Venus and Mercury, the octahedron. Kepler divided the regular polyhedra into the primaries and secondaries. Primaries are each of a different face, as opposed to the secondaries, which are all triangles. Primaries land on their faces, the secondaries on their edges, and cannot be placed without an awkward spectacle. Earth was of the supreme position because it lay at the intersection between the primaries and the secondaries. When Kepler found his pattern fit, at least enough for him, he burst into tears and, quote, vowed to God the All-Merciful that at the first opportunity I would make public in print this wonderful example of his wisdom. In a letter to Maestlin, he proclaimed that he intended to publish a book. Just as I pledged myself to God, so my intention remains. I wished to be a theologian, and for a while I was anguished. But now behold, God is glorified also in astronomy through my work. In 1596, Kepler had his work published under the title A Collection of Cosmographic Dissertations Containing a Cosmographic Mystery Concerning the Wonderful Proportion of the Celestial Orbs, usually shortened to Cosmographic Mystery. As collateral, he purchased 200 copies from the printer, which he proceeded to send away to every learned mathematician he could think of. From our perspective, the more important speculation Kepler engaged in at the time concerned why the planets appeared to move more slowly the further they were from the sun. He pondered if there could be some form of motive spirit emanating from the sun that held the planets in sway. This idea horrified Maestlin, who discouraged Kepler from seeking physics and astronomy, which for centuries had been purely mathematical. The insistence on physical causes made the cosmographical mystery a watershed in the history of science. Despite being, as you can probably guess from the fact that there are more than 6 planets in our solar system, essentially an act of wishful thinking. To quote science historian Owen Gingerich, seldom in history has so wrong a book been so seminal in directing the future of science. On a personal level, however, undoubtedly the most important event that took place during Kepler's time in Graz was his marriage to Barbara Müller, a well-off widow twice over, despite being just 24. Her father had initially refused the marriage on the correct grounds that Kepler was an impoverished schoolteacher who could never maintain his daughter's comfort at the level to which she had become accustomed. But Kepler persisted and eventually won her hand. However, his marriage was doomed to be as miserable as his mother's had been. In the first 2 years of their marriage, the Keplers would lose 2 children. This would prove to be yet another tragic thread in Kepler's life. Of the 13 children he would ultimately have, including his beloved stepdaughter from Barbara's previous marriage, all but 4 would die young, a harrowing record even for the time. It was at this point that Kepler made first contact with the man who would change his life, and with it, the course of scientific history. 25 years Kepler's senior, and with the advantage of aristocratic wealth, Tycho Brahe had already employed a combination of diligence, keen eyesight, and the most advanced instruments of his time to compile the most accurate map of the skies ever known. I have already made a video about Tycho, his accomplishments, and his oddments, so I won't be repeating myself here. Check the link above and follow the timestamps for the deep dive. Suffice to say that Tycho was a man of towering intellect, iron discipline, and staggering ego. Upon receiving his copy of the Cosmographic Mystery from Kepler, he recognized it as, quote, quite a brilliant speculation, but rightly cautioned Kepler not to let theory supersede observations. Tycho had a keen eye for talent, and immediately grasped Kepler's, but his ego, as fragile as it was expansive, would not let him trust Kepler absolutely. His reason was so asinine that I hesitate to record it, but given the impact it had on scientific history, it should be explained. In 1584, when Kepler was 13 and Tycho still in Denmark, Tycho received a guest at his astronomical palace of Uraniborg, a boorish former swineherd named Nicholas Reimers Baer, who Latinized his name to Ursus. Ursus had annoyed Tycho by speaking out of turn at the table and skulking around his library uninvited, leading Tycho to suspect him of pilfering his ideas. His suspicions were confirmed in 1598, when Ursus published a book claiming to have formulated a conception of the universe in which the Earth is stationary, orbited by the Sun, which is in turn orbited by the inferior planets, while the superior planets orbit the Earth. This formulation, a kind of midway point between geo and heliocentrism. Tycho rejected heliocentrism on both theological and observational grounds, mainly the absence of parallax, was as much in accordance with observations as its alternatives. Thing is, Tycho had formulated that system, and Ursus had almost certainly stolen it. To reinforce his claim, Ursus included a letter from Johannes Kepler, one of many obsequious letters he had sent out with the cosmographic mystery, begging recognition. Kepler was horrified at the news, since Ursus had never deigned to respond to Kepler's letter himself, nor to ask his permission before publishing it. Kepler was quick to inform Tycho of this, but the vagaries of the 17th century postal system meant they got their wires crossed. In December 1598, Kepler finally received a letter from Tycho, very much the letter of a lord to a subordinate, hesitantly congratulating him on his polyhedral theory, but chastising him for using the inadequate Copernican system to illustrate it. Certainly, Tycho said, such speculations would crumble once tested against his own observations, and his own world system would prove correct. Would Kepler like to perform such a test? Kepler was ecstatic. This was a job offer. Decoding and plotting Tycho's peerless observational data would take months, possibly years. It would provide him with the best possible data to test his hypotheses. Observations before then had margins of error of 10 arc-minutes, or a sixth of a degree. Tycho's observations, employing state-of-the-art instruments, were accurate to within 2 arc-minutes. But the letter came with a postscript composed in restrained fury, regarding Kepler's apparent endorsement of Ursus. Would he care to give a statement regarding Ursus's behavior that he might use in a prosecution? Kepler immediately understood the choice being offered. It was probably the easiest he ever made. Kepler soon found he had far deadlier adversaries than either Tycho or Ursus. In 1596, Ferdinand, grandson of the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand I, became Archduke Ferdinand of Inner Austria, not to be confused with his uncle, the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, or with his descendant, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, whose consequential death occurred 3 centuries later. Buoyed by his Catholic mother and fired by a series of provocations by overconfident Protestants, such as circulating caricatures of the Pope and ridiculing worship of the Virgin Mary, Ferdinand set about re-establishing Catholicism in his realm by banning all Protestant ministers and teachers on penalty of death. The same doom applied to taking Protestant sacraments or reading Protestant books. Kepler's position was uncertain. Obviously, he couldn't teach anymore, but he was still the district mathematician of Styria, a theoretically religiously neutral post. Also, he had retained sympathetic contacts among the Catholic nobility and was horrified by the extremism of his fellow Protestants. Even so, he was denied a Protestant burial for his second child, dead at just 35 days, without a fine. It is astonishing to think, with his second child freshly dead and the threat of exile hanging over him, that Kepler still pondered the nature of God's design. His polyhedral theory was, it seemed, a solid foundation, even if it wasn't exact, but it failed to answer the finer questions about planetary orbits, why they were each so uniquely offset from the center, and how their period, or year, was related to their distance from the Sun. For inspiration, he turned to one of the most influential and eccentric thinkers of all time, Pythagoras. Very little is known about the Greek philosopher Pythagoras. He lived during the tail end of the Greek Dark Age, and what tales of his life, character, and ideas exist were composed centuries after his death. One thing we can say for certain is that he did not invent the geometric equation named for him, which had already seen use in India and Babylon 1,000 years earlier. The discovery for which he, or his followers, the distinction is largely meaningless, since Greeks often assign philosophers credit for the discoveries of their disciples, in much the same way that today we say that Apple invented the iPhone, is placed among the giants of the history of science, is deeper, simpler, and more beautiful even than that. If you cut a string in half, the note it plays when plucked will be exactly 1 octave higher than its original length. An octave, therefore, has a ratio of 1 to 2. A ratio of 1 to 1.5, or, as the Greeks would say, 3 to 2, produced a perfect fifth. While a ratio of 1 to 1 1/3, or 4 to 3, produced a perfect fourth. The idea that the most beautiful intervals in music could be reduced to numbers fascinated the Pythagoreans, and they began to wonder, for the first time in history, if the entire universe could be reduced to numbers. While they may have been somewhat rigid in their conceptions, legend has it that they threw one of their own into the sea when he informed them that the square root of 2 was irrational, it's fair to say that 5 centuries of scientific advancement have suggested they were not wrong. Pythagoras proposed planets themselves emitted a hum specific to their orbits, which, as they crossed paths, would create harmonies and dissonances. This idea became known as the musica universalis, or music of the spheres. To Kepler, this harmony was sacrosanct. It was the foundation for his belief in astrology, as he believed, as Pythagoras did, that human life on Earth, and human beings in particular, were influenced by our subconscious reaction to these imperceptible sounds, from the moment of our birth. Pythagoras, reportedly, had constructed a scale based on the orbits of the 7 planets, including the Sun and the Moon. From Earth to the Moon, a tone. From the Moon to Mercury, a semitone. From Mercury to Venus, another semitone. From Venus to the Sun, a tone and a semitone. From the Sun to Mars, a tone. From Mars to Jupiter, a semitone. And from Jupiter to Saturn, a semitone. With an additional semitone to the sphere of the fixed stars, that completed 6 tones, or an octave. The Greeks, who apparently used only monophonic music, argued that there were only 3 consonant intervals, the 4th, the 5th, and the octave. But a recent revolution in musical theory, led partly by Vincenzo Galilei, Galileo's dad, had decided to catch up with musical practice, which in the previous 500 years had gone from this to this. To allow polyphonic music required the introduction of new consonances, such as the major third and major sixth, which Kepler allowed into his system on the empirical grounds that he liked them. And in 1599, Kepler composed his own heliocentric variation on Pythagoras' chord, based on the planets' relative velocities. Saturn and Jupiter's speeds were roughly in a 3 to 4 ratio, so their speeds together make a fourth. They're actually off by about 1%. Jupiter and Mars formed an octave. Off by about 4%. Mars and Earth, a major third. Off by about 2.5%. You get the idea. Earth to Venus, a minor third. Venus to Mercury, a fourth. Kepler was not happy with the resulting harmony, but, as he said, thus it is in the heavens. He even managed to tie some of the intervals to his polyhedral theory. Saturn and Jupiter's speeds were in a 3 to 4 ratio, and their polyhedron was a cube. The sum of the angles of the corner of a cube is 270 degrees, which is 3/4 of a circle. If this sounds a bit like ancient aliens talk to you, welcome to Kepler land. But his ideas needed to be tested against the best possible observations, and only Tycho had those observations. He wondered if they were precise enough to finally detect stellar parallax, the motion of stars against the outer sphere caused by the shift in perspective as the Earth travels around the Sun, that would be the proof that finally silenced the anti-Copernicans. In fact, such motion exists, but it is so incredibly tiny that it would be over 200 years before anyone saw it. Tycho had recently taken up Ursus's job as imperial mathematician to the Holy Roman Empire, and settled in outside the de facto capital, Prague. Kepler, conversely, with the security of his family and even his life increasingly precarious, had need of a new position. His alma mater, Tübingen, had slammed its doors to him the moment it learned that his personal religious beliefs differed slightly from the Lutheran orthodoxy. Kepler, you see, had an annoying habit of testing doctrines against Scripture and deciding on examination which he considered valid. Not even a human lifetime had passed since Martin Luther rifted Christianity, and yet his followers had already schismed into two opposing sects that loathed one another almost as much as the Catholics, the Lutherans and the Calvinists. Although Kepler's strong belief in free will meant he detested Calvin's famous belief in predestination, he did consider Calvin's position on the Eucharist to be correct. While both sects rejected the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, in which the host physically transforms into the body of Christ in the mouth of the worshipper, Lutheranism believed a spiritual transformation took place, while Calvinism believed that Christ remains in heaven and that the communion was a communication with him, rather than him coming down to us. For holding this belief, and for describing Calvinists as brothers in Christ, Kepler would be rejected by his fellow Lutherans for most of his life. As his options narrowed, Kepler turned his eye toward Tycho. To see him, he would have to go alone, leaving his family in Graz, and he would need to procure the funds for a 10-day journey. A contact of Kepler's at the Prague court, Baron Johann Hoffmann, offered not only to take Kepler to Prague, but to introduce him to Tycho. Seeing little alternative, Kepler headed east. In January 1600, Kepler arrived at Benátky Castle, the palace granted to Tycho by the emperor. Before his arrival, Tycho had written to him, "You will come not so much as a guest, but as a very welcome friend and highly desirable participant and companion in our observations of the heavens." This was, if not an outright lie, then wishful thinking. Kepler found himself in what he called a loneliness of people, an environment of constant noise and construction, babbling in languages he did not speak, and largely ignored by Tycho. Tycho was a feudal lord, who treated those below him as tools. Even Franz Tenachel, Tycho's noble-blooded right hand and future son-in-law, he described as his manservant. Astoundingly to anyone unfamiliar with Tycho, he still harbored suspicion of Kepler over the Ursus affair, and this likely contributed to his reluctance to show Kepler his observations, the reason for Kepler's presence at his home in the first place. This suspicion was, oddly, good for Kepler, because it meant that Tycho thought him better at his castle. Kepler also quickly learned that Tycho's description of him as a friend and a guest was code for not a paid employee. Tycho considered Kepler's constant demands for his employment a slight on his honor. Kepler's frustration at Tycho's stinginess, both with money and with his observations, spilled over in a letter. "My opinion of Tycho is this. He has abundant wealth. Only, like most rich men, he does not know how to make proper use of his riches. Therefore, one must take pains to wring his treasures from him." But there was a deeper reason for Tycho's distraction. In many ways, Tycho and Kepler were in the same boat. Just as Kepler faced exile from Graz and received a salary largely out of pity from his superiors, Tycho had been exiled from Denmark. Each faced the prospect of relying on their brilliance to please unpredictable and capricious patrons. For Kepler, that was Tycho. For Tycho, it was the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II. In a time replete with eccentrics, Rudolf II stood proudly out from the crowd. He was a loner who spent most of his time in his treasure room, playing with his treasures and toys, to the point where foreign dignitaries often had to wait weeks for an interview. His constant expenditure on his private collection meant that the court was perennially broke. As Tycho knew, and Kepler would learn, a promise of payment from Rudolf was little more than an expression of goodwill. Tycho had yet to be paid, and yet spent much of his time in Prague, away from his work, giving Rudolf astrological advice. Tycho himself found astrology pointless, but of course, if he tried to convince Rudolf of that, he would be out of a job. But beyond all this, Tycho probably saw in Kepler, the skilled, independent-minded Copernican, a latent threat. Tycho did not wish only to go down in history. He wanted to be the fulcrum around which scientific history turned. His universe system, the Tychonic system, not that of Copernicus, would be the system to replace Ptolemy. He knew Kepler had the mind to prove him right. Possibly he was the only man alive who could, but he also had the mind to prove him wrong. If Tycho kept his results to himself, he could make any claim he liked. Tycho was astute enough to understand that Kepler looked down on his system. In his letters he described it as, quote, a patchwork of little paper houses. Giving him his observations was a danger. Realizing that Kepler had to at least be doing something, Tycho assigned him the job of plotting out the orbit of Mars. No other planets, just Mars. But using those Mars observations, Kepler, at least dimly, was able to see that the Earth, like any other planet in the Copernican system, does indeed speed up and slow down as it moves closer to and farther from the Sun. You can imagine how well Tycho took that news. With tensions between the pair rising, and the carrot of a salary dangled one too many times in front of him, Kepler did something he almost never did: completely lose it. He could not bring his family away from Graz, their home, their friends, and most importantly, their source of income, without some promise of compensation. After one final inconclusive conversation at the dinner table, Kepler exploded in an outburst that nearly ended his career. Under any other circumstances, Tycho would likely have been happy to see the back of the moody, antisocial oddball. But he knew he needed Kepler. So, in a reaction that will astound anyone who watched my video on Tycho, the man welcomed Kepler back with open arms, but still wouldn't pay him. Kepler returned to Graz in the spring of 1600, only to find his situation worse than he imagined. His paymasters had soured on astronomy and demanded that he travel to Italy to study medicine if he wanted to continue to receive his salary. Out of options, Kepler turned to the last person he would sanely choose as a prospective patron, Archduke Ferdinand. The closest he got to a reply came on the 27th of July, a notice on the city wall demanding that all citizens publicly assert their Catholic faith, or face exile. Out of 1,000 or so citizens of Graz, 61 chose the latter. Kepler was one of them. Kepler accepted the judgment with characteristic equanimity. I would not have thought that it is so sweet, in companionship of some brothers, to suffer injury and indignity for the sake of religion, to abandon house, fields, friends, and homeland. If it is this way with real martyrdom, then it is an easy matter also to die for faith. That was all well and good, but he now had 6 weeks to find a home, a protector, and a means to provide for his wife and children. Kepler had tried one last supplication to Tübingen, but if that failed, as it almost certainly would, then his only hope was Tycho Brahe. On September 30th, 1600, 2 weeks after the deadline, Kepler packed his life and family into wagons and headed out of his home country. He had no clear place to go, but ambled his way ever closer to Prague, putting his fate in the hands of Tycho. By winter he had fallen into a fever which would not break for months. Kepler began to wonder if his time on Earth was coming to a close. Here in Prague I have found everything uncertain, he wrote to Maslin, even my life. For his wife, exile was a nightmare. Everything she knew was in Württemberg, her family, her friends, and her inherited property. The cost of living in Prague was 4 times what it had been in Graz, and with her husband now without a salary, she became fanatically frugal. Everything the Keplers had now depended on Tycho. All hopes for a salary lay with Rudolf, which meant they were almost certainly dashed, and Tycho had to pay them out of his own pocket, including, once Kepler's fever broke, housing them with his own family at the residence in Prague. On the plus side, autumn also saw the death of Ursus, of illness and not, as Tycho had desired, quote, branded in infamy and beheaded or quartered according to Bohemian law. With Ursus, Tycho's main reason for mistrusting Kepler passed away. Tycho then used his influence with the emperor to have every copy of Ursus's book banned, collected, and burned. He then ordered Kepler to compose a letter arguing against Ursus, even though he was already dead. Thankfully, like many egomaniacs, Tycho was an excellent showman, and, in the autumn of 1601, brought Kepler to the imperial court. He put forward a proposal to the emperor. The dynamic duo of Kepler and Tycho would together create the single most accurate and comprehensive table of astronomical observations in history. It will put all other tables to shame and be the new standard by which others were measured. Every navigator, astrologer, and doctor in the world would want to purchase it, and it would be called the Rudolphine Tables. All that would be required of the emperor to speed it to completion was a salary for Kepler. It worked. And then, on October 13th, 1601, a series of events took place that have passed so far into legend they have touched the ears of people who have never heard of Tycho Brahe. Tycho dined at the home of a minor noble, and, a slave to etiquette, refused to leave the room to empty his bladder before his host. When he returned home, he found he could not urinate, save for small quantities and with extreme pain. He then spent 11 days passing in and out of delirium. His last words, repeated over and over again, were, "Let it not seem that I lived in vain." Whether these words were to God or Kepler is not known. By dying, Tycho had done Kepler the biggest favor of his life. In his last hours, he granted Kepler use of his materials, provided that he employ the Tychonic rather than the Copernican system in his analysis. Kepler now assumed Tycho's position as the imperial mathematician, and would begin the greatest posthumous collaboration in the history of science. Unfortunately, Kepler did not inherit the rights to Tycho's writings. Tycho's family did. Specifically, his son-in-law, Franz Tegnahel, and Tegnahel did not like Copernicanism. Kepler would spend the next decade in a two-way battle, first with Tycho's heirs for access to his data, and then with Rudolf II for his promised salary, which he would not receive for 5 months. So often and so vociferously did Kepler pester the imperial treasury that to this day a nasty jibe at him remains scribbled in the margins of the court accounts. Astoundingly, Tegnahel managed to convince Rudolf to give him the project of drafting the Rudolphine Tables at double Kepler's salary, and thus demanded Kepler return all of Tycho's data. Kepler did so, except for the Mars observations, on the assumption that Tegnahel would not notice they were gone. He didn't, for a year, but eventually Kepler had to hand them back. On yet another front, his marriage continued to wither, as his wife, away from her family and friends, grew bitter and despondent. That said, it can be objectively stated that the 10 years Kepler spent in Prague were the best of his life. He was the most high-profile astronomer in the largest empire in Europe, a position that gained him respect and acclaim, even if not always adequate recompense. He and his family were more or less secure from both penury and persecution. What Kepler couldn't get from Rudolf, he scraped from commissions from his many rich acquaintances, and it was during this time that he made his greatest contributions to science. In 1602, for instance, at the polite urging of the emperor, he published The Optical Part of Astronomy, in which, for the first time in history, he outlined the means by which the eye captures and refracts light, how lenses corrected for near and far-sightedness, and how phenomena like refraction and reflection affected astronomical observations. He also independently discovered the inverse square law for light, that, since light rays expand in a sphere, the intensity for one standing a given distance away from a source decreases by the square of that distance. In October 1604, what we now call a Type I supernova occurred in the constellation of Ophiuchus. It was the last supernova clearly visible to the naked eye. Kepler initially disbelieved the news due to cloudy skies, but when they cleared, followed his now dead patron, Tycho, in composing a treatise on it. This treatise, called De Stella Nova, not to be confused with Tycho's treatise, De Nova Stella, not only meticulously recorded Kepler's observations, but also the observations of others, making it to this day an invaluable historical document, and earning the supernova of 1604 the moniker Kepler's supernova. Europe's populace of astrologers felt that the new star, occurring so close to the grand conjunction of 1603, marked the 200-year period of the fiery trigon, in which the conjunctions would occur in the constellations tied to the fire element. Such an event at the dawn of such an age could only presage calamity. Kepler, who by then had soured at casting horoscopes, composed a letter to the panicked court that he predicted a rise in book sales, as a flood of astrologers attempted to print their ideas, and also that, star or no star, it is always advisable to confess and repent one's sins. Kepler's supernova marked the end of an auspicious year for him. That summer, Technahel had admitted defeat and handed him Tycho's observations, realizing he could never complete the Rudolphine tables by himself. Rather than continue the tables, however, Kepler decided to focus on Mars. The problem of Mars, as it was called, had been known since antiquity. Of all of the planets, its orbit was the most eccentric, and required the most rejigging to fit the geocentric system. Both Tycho and Kepler believed that cracking Mars would be the key to proving which universal conception, Ptolemy's, Tycho's, or Copernicus's, was correct. Kepler also hoped that Mars might prove his theories on polyhedra or harmonies, and so began what he called a war with Mars, likely a reference to Mars as the god of war and not to any interplanetary conflict. He outlined this war in a 650-page doorstopper called Astronomia Nova, which he didn't expect to reach a wide audience, as it did not, but, as he said in a later book, quote, "I can scoff at mortals with the frank confession that I am stealing the golden vessels of the Egyptians to build with them a tabernacle for my God, far from the bounds of Egypt. If you indulge me, I will rejoice. If you are angry, I will bear it. I throw the die and write the book. It matters not whether it will be read now or in the future. Let it wait 100 years for its reader, as God himself has awaited a witness for 6,000 years. Yes, Johannes Kepler genuinely believed God had waited 6,000 years for him. Not sure if that makes him a prophet. Kepler had one all-consuming belief. The sun was the driving force for the planet's orbits. For that, he abandoned the epicycles of Ptolemy and Copernicus in favor of the equant, the seemingly arbitrary dislocation in perspective that Copernicus had worked so hard to remove. But unlike Ptolemy, he made no assumptions as to where the equant was located. This required working with 4 unknown variables rather than 3, a feat that took Kepler 70 tries to accomplish to his satisfaction. If you are wearied by this tedious procedure, wrote Kepler in Astronomia Nova, take pity on me who carried out these 70 trials. Seriously, money was too tight for an assistant. He was doing all this himself. He pondered what form the motive force would take. He assumed the sun had to be rotating, as it must be carrying the planets with it on its cosmic lanyard. One of many examples of Kepler being right for the wrong reasons. He compared the motive spirit to light, but, oddly, did not assume that it followed an inverse square law. If he had, he might have discovered the law of gravitation 80 years early. In the end, Kepler found a plot for Mars's orbit that agreed with all observations to within Tycho's margin of error of 2 arc-minutes, if one only cared about angular position as viewed from the sun. But Kepler wanted to find the actual distances, except the only way he could do that was to place the equant back where Ptolemy had it, a decision that caused the entire house to collapse. The resulting discrepancy was as much as 8 arc-minutes, 4 times the margin of error for Tycho's observations. These 8 minutes, said Kepler, showed the way to a renovation of the whole of astronomy. It would be a while before he learned what that way was. The first thing he needed was a more accurate idea of the Earth's orbit. But how does one attain such a thing from the orbits of the other planets? Then, in one of his glorious flights of fancy, Kepler was able, by imagining himself stationed above Mars, as if from a watchtower, to see Earth's orbit unfold before him. With Tycho's data, Kepler was able to show that all the planets, even Earth, move more quickly closer to the Sun and more slowly further away. So Kepler had arrived at a law of nature, even if he had yet to work out the precise relationship involved. But why should the planets be moving closer or further away from the Sun in the first place? Kepler recalled a proof by Archimedes in calculating the area of a circle. Realizing that a circle was really a polygon with an infinite number of sides, Archimedes imagined constructing a parallelogram out of an infinite number of triangles, their bases at the rim, their points at the center. It was at this point that Kepler cracked it. While a planet may change its speed as it comes closer to the Sun, and decrease as it moves farther away, the area of the wedge between the Sun and the orbital segment remains the same. So, if a planet is close to the Sun, it moves more quickly, creating a wide but short wedge. As it moves farther away, it moves more slowly, creating a narrow but long wedge. But wide or short, narrow or long, the area of the wedge always remains the same. Or, as he put it, the radius vector describes equal areas in equal times. This was it. A genuine cast-iron law of nature. It applied to every planet, and indeed every object orbiting the Sun. If God had a plan, this must have been part of it. Confusingly, today we call this law Kepler's second law of planetary motion, even though it was the first he discovered. He had half discovered his distance rule, which we now even more inaccurately call his third law, but he had yet to formulate it precisely. But Kepler was not happy. He didn't trust his area rule because he couldn't apply it to Mars. Mars's orbit did not seem to make sense at all. To Kepler, who believed geometry the true expression of the world, this was peeving. In a rare jibe at God, he wrote, quote, "Heretofore we have not seen such an ungeometrical conception as with his other works." He began to wonder if Mars's orbit was an oval rather than a circle, but concluded that if it were, this problem would have been solved by Archimedes. Mars was driving Kepler to distraction. And then, suddenly, everything fell into place. The precise orbit was neither a circle nor an oval, but an ellipse with the Sun at one focus. Kepler now had his first law. Well, second. Never mind. You may wonder why no one conceived of these ideas before Kepler. And the simple answer is, no one could have. Before Tycho and his revolutionary observatory, the margin of error for astronomical observations was as much as 10 arc minutes. The ellipses found by Kepler are so close to perfect circles that, confronted with such uncertainty, their deviations simply disappear. Tycho was as vital for this breakthrough as Kepler. Astronomia Nova, while not exactly a page-turner, was a landmark in scientific history, the necessary bridge between the speculations of Copernicus and the final unified physics of Newton. It allowed for the first time a vision of the universe that was simple, precise, and comprehensive. Gone were the spirograph artworks of Ptolemy and Copernicus with their motions on top of motions. From now, the planets only had one motion. Kepler's laws provided a single equation by which all the planets could be measured together, rather than viewed individually, as Ptolemy had done. For the first time, Kepler had unified the motions of the planets into a single system. A solar system, if you will. But perhaps the most profound contribution made by Kepler to the history of science was his willingness to scrap his preconceptions, to attack his problems, as he put it, armed with incredulity. Kepler went where the math took him, and arrived somewhere utterly new. Okay, this is not going to be finished in one video. For those of my wonderful fellow seekers who managed to stick with me all the way here, thank you. And if you like this video, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, and join me for the sequel, in which Kepler finds his third law, takes a trip to the moon, and nearly loses a witch trial.